Welcome to the Psych Eval podcast. This podcast is about
evidence-based research to support mental health,
psychiatric practice,
and frontline workers.
You can expect to hear viewpoints from nursing
and law enforcement.
We're your hosts, Jessica
and James.
So on this week's podcast, it is our first episode of Book Club about mental health, mental well-being, psychiatric practice, and even viewpoints from law enforcement.
On today's episode, we're going to be talking about the book, What Happened to You? And this is by Bruce D. Perry and Oprah Winfrey. On New York Times, it was reviewed as one of the top 10 books of the year. I personally like this book from someone that is being introduced into mental health and well-being and having a viewpoint in law enforcement. So it was a good introduction. I personally really liked Mr. Perry's viewpoint on it. In the book, unfortunately, I felt that Oprah Winfrey took away from it. I understood why she was brought into the book, because a lot of people can relate to Oprah Winfrey from her show and also relate to her as being a reporter and interviewer. She has that connection with people. But personally for me, I could read stories about Bruce Perry and his experiences all day. And also his viewpoint on PTSD, mental health. I know you feel differently about it because you have a different level of experience than I do with the mind and how the brain works. But I felt this was a very good intro for me to get started on. And I also really liked his stories of like children that he worked with. There was one individual that he talked about PTSD and getting triggered when he was exposed to a teacher that had the same deodorant as his father. And yeah, I felt that was a very good introduction on me personally I thought it was a good way to start off this book club for me.
Awesome. Yeah, so for me, I felt like this is a book that I would recommend to maybe a patient or a friend or somebody who's coming into the mental health space, trying to understand trauma, briefly touches on like PTSD and like trauma responses and things like that. It is a very beginner basic level. It's a great introduction. And I like that we read this book first and now we're jumping to Body Keeps the Score is going to be our second one, because that one is 4 steps up from this book, I would say.
Yeah, and I agree with that too.
I also thought this book, the way it's written, you have Dr. Perry talking and then Oprah, and it's almost like a long form interview, the way it's written. I do agree that Dr. Perry has more the scientific kind of viewpoints, which is probably why you liked what he said, because you have a very like analytical scientist mind like me. And I do feel like Oprah, she made it like more light and fluffy, which is why I think is good for a beginner. The thing I did like about Oprah is she talked about her childhood abuse, which in some instances was things like her mother hitting her, or it was her grandmother hitting her. And that kind of makes it more relatable for people, I think. Traumas aren't always some big catastrophic event, right? Like some horrific sexual abuse or some horrific physical abuse where you were beat almost to death. No, trauma can be things like one experience that she talked about in the sense of what I was saying, a small thing was, I remember she talked about how with her grandmother, like you couldn't talk back. You just had to take it. A part where she talked about that she couldn't talk back or stand up for herself or anything like that. So she went through life being a people pleaser. And I think that's relatable to so many people, because when we're little, it's very common for parents to be like, I'm the adult, you're the child, you're doing it because I told you to. And realistically, even with children, we should be explaining why they can't do things. And just something as simple as that. You can't make decisions because I'm the adult and I'm telling you to. Like, for some people, that will manifest as a people pleaser. And I've seen that with a lot of people. And that's fairly common, right? These are things people aren't educated on, so they're not expected to know. But yeah, so I thought that this book, in summary, was really relatable for a lot of people. It's a very basic kind of introduction to trauma. So, I mean, I thought it was okay.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you with the fact that I'm glad that I read this book first compared to The Body Keeps the Score.
I know, because you text me, you're like, I have to reread paragraphs. The Body Keeps the Score.
So it's one of those things that just like the level of understanding and the content in it is this is a good book for someone who is getting off training wheels, and then
Yes.
and then the body keeps the score. It's like trying to figure out how to ride a motorcycle.
Hey, that's exactly what I was just thinking.
There's a way, like, the content and the level of it is entirely different, but this is relatable, and they keep it that way, I think, specifically because Bruce Perry could probably write a book similar to The Body Keeps the Score if he wanted to. He could have that same level of content, but it would totally take away from the content compared to Oprah Winfrey saying that stuff. So imagine he says something entirely complex, and then Oprah Winfrey goes, "What does that mean?" As a
Right?
it's not gonna go for the targeted audience.
In nursing, they teach us to teach patients at a 5th grade level because a lot of people aren't very educated in healthcare specific things, and I feel like this is like that too. If you are brand new into like mental wellness and things like that, and we give somebody like The Body Keeps the Score, like they're going to read the first chapter and be like, this is way too dense. This is way too much. I can't read this and understand. But this book really explains things like very easily to understand. It keeps it more so basic. You're not talking about like neural pathways or neurotransmitters or that, or even different parts of the brain. I think at one point they do talk about the amygdala is the more animalistic part of the brain.
It's going straight to the point and also explaining the point in a way that the general audience can understand, or the target audience, because Oprah Winfrey is she's trying to make a wholesome book. She's trying to make it into one of the biggest points about this book is your body retains stress. And on top of that, you learn things from a young age. And in addition, you learn those things through a young age, and that affects you throughout your life until you recognize it and then learn how to overcome it. The book is through the title of What Happened to You?
Right.
What's going on in your life? What did you have in your childhood that relates to you behaving as an adult, which relates to you having a negative coping skill or a thought process or being able to perceive the world around you in a way that may be different than someone else?
That was so perfectly put. That was great. Yeah, that's exactly. So the way that the book is set up is there's 3 parts, and it goes from understanding trauma to childhood trauma and then what you can do to treat trauma. So I know you put a lot of bookmarks in your book.
Just
a lot of a lot of bookmarks in there. So maybe I'll just go over some of the stuff I wrote down, and then you can chime in, or if you want to find certain things in your book that you want to go over, we can do that too. But I thought we could touch on some of the main kind of points.
The things I'm going to specifically focus on with my notes is I really liked the actual hands-on experience that Perry mentioned, whether it's like seeing the kid at the airport or the different childhood traumas and interactions with them and how to treat them and stuff like that. That's the way I'm going to be going through my notes to look at that specifically. Just giving a foreshadowing on that.
I just wrote some notes that I thought were like key points that were in the book that to just pass up. Childhood trauma, we know, has long-lasting effects. It can affect brain development because our brain is developing during the first years of life. And these can make up our worldview, our personality, and our behaviors. So we know that the trauma that happens to you as children can really change who you are as a person. What happens to us as children can really affect development, but because our brains are developing. They talked about the window of tolerance. So all of us have a window of tolerance where our bodies can deal with stress, but we come back to baseline, deal with stress, come back to baseline, right? It's our resiliency. But you can go out of this window of tolerance into a hyperarousal or hypoarousal. So your hyperarousal would be things like very on edge, looking over your shoulder, that those stress, cortisol, and all that stuff pumping through your body. And if you're in that state for a long time, that's where you can get certain medical conditions are associated with. It is not healthy for our bodies to be in a state of hyperarousal. Then there's also hypoarousal, which you can get the depression, dissociation, and that's not a good place to be either. So that's another thing I liked that they talked about in the book, the stress response people have, and that's why we need coping mechanisms and things like that to stay in our window. I could just keep going on and on. Do you have anything you want to add?
No, I'm just thinking, again, relating to The Body Keeps the Score compared to this too. They had both major parts on dissociation and stuff like that, and like hypovigilance, which that was really covered on to, and just thinking, I forget which book it was actually in, but talk about a rape victim. I think it was Body Keeps a Score, but I saw this happening and it wasn't me that it was happening to, and I would just think that, I'm thinking that situation happened to someone else.
Oh yeah, I think that's the Body Keeps a Score.
Yeah,
but yes,
I'm pretty sure it was.
Yep.
But I mean, you could just, another example from this book, the family with the colt from Texas, and the children, how they interacted with the psychiatrist and law enforcement and stuff, and they thought they were the enemy because that's how they were groomed and stuff like that. And they had that hyper vigilance, and then because they were so stressed out, it went from hyper to hypo.
Right.
And then they had to do the treatment of, okay, we'll give them a ball. And then see if they'll eventually give us the ball back.
Yep.
And that development and stuff like that.
Yes. I know you remember a lot of stories from the book. I feel like when you reference them, it takes me a minute to remember them. You do a good job remembering what you read. So another thing that was in this book was it talked about the different types of dissociation, which we won't go through them all, but there's 4. And part of that was a type of dissociation where people don't remember. They have a loss of memories. And I see this a lot with patients that have a history of trauma. They'll be like, I don't remember anything that happened to me before the age of 10. That should be a red flag that some bad things could have happened. Do you know what I mean? Imagine just having no memories from your childhood.
Enough in this book, another story is, I believe, is Jesse or Jess. It was the child that his father was abusive and stuff and pushed him down a flight of stairs, and he was in a coma for 2 months. Oh. But then in the epilogue, Perry goes and sees him and goes, do you remember any of that? And it wasn't the fact that claimed originally that he didn't remember, but how much of it was like not remembering or choosing not to remember, or the fact that he was embarrassed about the situation. So he's like, oh no, I remember most of it. And that also, you wonder through therapy and stuff, was it something that he actually didn't remember at that point? And then he started remembering once he was in a better mindset.
Yeah. Speaking of mind, you have a fantastic memory.
So just for the podcast, just to also clarify, Jess likes to listen to the audiobook on her way to work. And that's how she read it. I like to actually have to feel the book in my hand, and that's how I read. And one of the things, if you actually have a hard copy, Perry will have black. He'll specifically write in black. Oprah Winfrey will have italicized in blue in the copy. And even just that interaction, I mean, that, going back to what you said previously, makes it similar to an interview, which I think that's what they were trying to do in the book.
Right. Yep.
I personally feel like that took away a little bit from the book, but it also made it more relatable to a broader targeted audience.
And if you listen to the audiobook, you're not seeing, there's some good images in the book, which you're not seeing, but the thing is, there is an audiobook. I would recommend the audiobook if you do not have time to read a book. For me, driving to work, I don't like listening to the same song over and over again on the radio. I feel like it's a waste of time. So I think it's a perfect time to listen to an audiobook. So that'd be my recommendation. Definitely say, you can tell us talking to that James has a way better memory of the stories and the book itself. And I think you get that when you're reading the book. When you're listening to it, it's easy to daze off.
Both ways are great. But there's 2 entirely different experiences with how you got the book compared to how I got the book. And it's one of those things, like, I personally like to have the book in my hand when I'm reading it. I like actually having the book in my hand. I think my favorite story in this book was, it didn't even really have any childhood trauma or anything like that in it. It was when Perry was in the airport and there was a bad snowstorm, and he was sitting there and there was a businessman, and he has the child that runs over to him and wants to play with him because just being a curious child. And the businessman could have had an entirely bad day and stuff like that. He could have perceived it in an entirely different way, but he chose to play with the kid and also just enjoy the moment. And I felt that was a beautiful moment in this book, because that was a good, positive interaction with that child. And that child was based off having good parents and stuff like that, believing in the good of other people. So it was just being a little kid. But the thing I thought was awesome in the book was it could have just shown that, like, if that person was in a negative mindset, that could have affected the child also. But not only could have affected the child based off his negative reaction, but it also reflects on the businessman himself also, because it shows that he also had a good childhood and good development, and also having the rationalization and realization that he's dealing with a child, and no matter what kind of bad day that he had, he was still going to have a good reflection on that child also. And I think that just has many different parts ingrained into this book in that given moment, and it led into a very wholesome, positive part and aspect in the book, considering of what else was going on.
You're so good, because when I read that story, I got a totally different interpretation.
Okay, what was your interpretation then?
So I thought that the guy in the airport was total mean person, and that his flight got delayed. He was having a total fit because he was being all grumpy. So he's waiting for his flight, all grumpy. And this kid comes over with a ball, like trying to play with him. And at first he was not about it, but then the kid kept like trying. And then finally he did start playing with him. So my two things for this was like, one good thing was sometimes we may have patients, or maybe we have people in our life that aren't like open and receptive to treatment or making their life better, or maybe they're self-sabotaging or whatever, and us just having that genuine trying to help, like at some point we might be able to get through to them. So that was one part. So that was a positive thing that related to yours. The other part of me, I'm so jaded. In what world would I ever let my child go play ball with a random stranger in the airport? Don't play with them. Don't groom them. I am so jaded after the stuff I've seen. I think too, also now in thinking back at it, I think it also brings in perspective, right? If you're in the airport and you see this guy that's like totally grumpy and rude and all this stuff, that's our perspective. But we don't know if his mother just died and he's trying to make it to the funeral on time and this is the last flight out. Or maybe he does have some big business meeting that if he doesn't seal the deal, he was told that he's going to be fired and he's got 4 kids at home. We don't know the backstory of these negative behaviors as well. In the book, they described him as not a nice man. And why is he not a nice man? There are some bad people. I know you see them all the time. I see them occasionally. There are some bad people, but I think they're not as often as we think.
But again, the part I thought was beautiful, this kid was just a little ball of joy. And this person could have been just like, go away, kid. I don't want to deal with you. But he, again, positive vibes, usually like energies spread from one person to another. And I have a full belief of that. And I've literally seen it. And if I go on shift one day and then there's one person that you could just tell that they're angry and they're in an ugly mood, more than often than not, that ugly mood is going to spread from one person to another person. Totally. It's going to change the vibe, the whole entire shift.
I hate bad vibes.
Or we could take the high road and turn that into positive energy. And positive energy spreads just as much as negative energy too.
So another thing in the book that I like that they talked about is like the vicious cycle, right? The child doesn't get loved and they believe that they have an inability to love and be loved. It then creates a vicious cycle where they might seek out relationships where they don't receive love genuinely. It's like that abuse cycle, right? Yeah. They always question, you see it like kids who are abused as children might get in relationships where they're then abused as girlfriends or boyfriends or whatever. So I just thought that was interesting because I think that's something that we see a lot in our society. You seek out things that remind you of other things.
You see it with like, especially with dating and stuff like that. And then you obviously tell when someone has daddy issues.
Oh yeah. Or mommy issues. This is not a one-way street. Let me tell you, mommy issues are just as bad as daddy issues.
But you can tell there's a relation.
Isn't it funny that it presents differently though? Like you can tell when someone's got mommy issues and when someone has daddy issues.
You could tell when someone who is an alcoholic father goes and finds an alcoholic boyfriend, goes and then has that interactions, and then they have a child, and then that child has that same behavior. The Bach book does talk about breaking that cycle at some point, but that's through a lot of reinforcement of good behaviors to even reach that point. And then everyone hits rock bottom before they have to rise up.
Yeah, I think it's important to note too that you don't have to have bad parent to have like daddy or mommy issues, right? Let's say you have 10 brothers and sisters and it's just you feel you're not getting enough attention from one of the parents because there's so many other siblings and they probably have lives and they're working and all of these things. You could then have an issue where you just feel I'm not good enough. You could have the best parents in the world, but genuinely feel deep down in your core that you are not good enough because maybe you're a high achieving person whose actions weren't validated as a child. And so you have developed this issue with a parent because you felt like you didn't get that validation that you needed. So you may see people in this world that choose terrible relationships, but they have fantastic parents. It's also how we perceive the world around us. And I think that's a big thing. And you learn that too in therapy and in life. Perception is everything.
Going back into the book, the 18-year-old mother with the kid who had diabetes, there was abuse, and she turned into a prostitute, and then she had a child.
Okay, I remember what you're talking about now. So the child had diabetes. The mother had a long history of abuse. And so the issue was that the child had diabetes and the mother was giving candy. So Dr. Perry was pulled in as a treatment team person. And so one thing to note about this is when people go through severe abuse as children, sometimes they stay in that mindset, right? So they have like the mentality of a 10-year-old or 12, like wherever they were, they can developmentally get stuck there, but regardless. But the big thing was giving the child candy. So when Dr. Perry came in and talked to them, I'm trying to figure out why, because we always want to ask what happened to you? Why are people doing this? The way that I think it was like her mom or something would show her that she cared about her was to give her candy. So that was the only thing that she understood of a way to be like, I care about you. I love you. All of this stuff. She didn't know how to express that, but would give the child candy because that's the way she'd express it. So all they did is make sure the candy was sugar-free candy. And that was a way they could help the mom and the child to bond versus I think it started off that the social worker was like upset that she was giving her candy, and we got to work with our patients. It's not always going to be black and white. We got to work in that gray area.
And this goes into another point too. If we talk about animal behavior, we talk about the body keeps a score, and we talk about this book per se. One of the things they tell you about animal behavior, if you take an animal behavior class, is animals learn behavior from a young age. And if they're separated from other animals that do that normal behavior, they're going to act in a different way. For example, if you have an animal that is in the wild, but then you take it in and rehabilitate it, it's going to have behaviors that are going to be different than an animal that's in the wild. For example, one of the big characteristics is being used to humans. Like an animal may not necessarily, it would be skittish or run away. It'd be exclusive to animals, to humans, but when it's being raised by humans and it is in a non-rehabilitative setting, animals can't be brought back into the wildlife because they may have been fed something different, they may have been touched by a person, they may smell like a person, but because of what we do in that setting compared to a wildlife setting, it's entirely different. Bring it back to this book. If you have a behavior that is different than what you would normally do with a child, like for example, like extreme example, you have a child and it gets locked in a closet for a year. Or
my heart.
But
yeah,
extreme example, but that child is not going to have social interaction and development or educational skills that a child the same age is going to have. It's going to have animalistic behaviors, but it's going to be different than everything else because that's based off the environment it grew and adapted in.
Exactly. I've seen this in practice where children get locked in a closet for every day for years, and then caretakers are like, I don't know why they act like an animal. You totally deprived them of all emotional and connection and learning. Imagine being locked in a closet, like the severe neglect. It's just terrible. It's heartbreaking.
But that's an extreme example.
But it happens.
Yeah.
And it's
but
true.
I mean, like, learned behavior is as simple as you're a kid, you go towards a stove, you touch the stove while it's on, and you get burnt. Negative interaction, you realize, oh, fire hurts.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. I think the third part of the book goes over different treatments for trauma or the healing process. That's what they call it. And a lot of it is being engaged in your community. They talked a lot about that having social support is very important. So that kind of goes off of that as well. And then there's just like a lot of other stuff like having compassion for yourself. They go over like stress responses, how to encourage healthy brain development in children, how to ease stress responses. There's definitely a lot of good stuff in this book, especially if you're new to this space. It also talks about attachment theory. It touches on it briefly.
I know I said that Oprah took away from the book, but there was one part that I thought that she really touched on that I liked, and that was close towards the epilogue when she was having the interactions with her mother.
Oh, yes.
And I felt like it was a little bit of a build-up. I really wish that part was sooner in the book, but at the very end, and what was happening is she was talking about her mother was not the best caregiver, but she did the best she could. And then there was a level of forgiveness, which goes into the treatment part. And that forgiveness of her mom, of how she treated her, and she was just, the way that she worded it was, you gave me the best care you could give. And there was that level of closure because her mother was dying of cancer when she was saying this to her. And there was a level of courage that she had to build up before even saying it in the first place. There were several interactions that she had with her mom that they really didn't say anything to each other because she didn't have the courage to say it, and her mom didn't really want to say anything either. And it was just that build up towards it. So even with us being adults, and the viewers, I'm going to say this is going to be more of a targeted audience for adults for this podcast. It doesn't matter at what level of life you are. You can have a level of forgiveness. You could build on your mental health, and you can change behaviors that you have learned as a child, and you can recognize them, adapt, and overcome.
And I think that's so important with the title of What Happened to You, because I think a lot of times people hold things in, like they know that maybe there was this experience or perception of their childhood or something that happened to them that is making them upset, unstable, is just adding added stress. And it can take a lot to say something, to say, I need help, or I want to work through this, or I want to figure out what's going on with my body. Why every time I see something, I get a hyperactive response, or why don't I remember my childhood? Whatever it is, it's important to say something. And I think that story kind of touches on that, because Oprah spoke about a lot of times that she was like, just going to leave. And then she was like, I knew I wanted to say it. I knew this would be my last time to say it, to get that closure and things like that. And I think a lot of people just at some point, they hit that point where they're like, I want to work through this. I want to be a better person. That kind of goes into mindset, having a growth mindset. I want to be better, do better, work through this. So that is one takeaway. If you're a provider and you work with mental health patients, just being understanding that everyone has a history of trauma. A lot of people won't talk about it, so you might not know what happens to them. But if they do tell you, that can give us a lot of info into why they may be presenting in a certain way.
And to add on to that, it doesn't necessarily have to be your childhood. It could be something that happens tomorrow. It could be something that it could be in a relationship. It could be with your parents. It could be with a friend. Something happens to you that changes your mentality and thought process tomorrow. You can overcome that and grow from it and have a growth mindset to it.
And I personally believe, like, we all have our issues. We all have our traumas. They don't have to be what they call big T traumas. Those like locked in a closet, sexual abuse, intense physical abuse. Like, it doesn't have to be that. It can be maybe you felt like you didn't get enough recognition. Maybe it could be something even like at work, you worked really hard on this project and your boss was just like, yeah, that was stupid. I don't like that. Like, maybe that really affected you deep down because you worked so hard. You've been working at this career. You wanted a promotion, all of these things. Like, there are like non-big T traumas. We all have them, and they're all things that we have to work through. We're all messed up, complex human beings. I think whoever you are, this stuff can help you understanding trauma and how to relax and turn down that hypervigilance and things like that. I think it's important.
Yeah, not only to recognize it, but to grow from it and become a better person through it. And overall, my opinion on this is this book is a good read, and it's a wholesome read as well.
I concur. Okay. Hope you guys enjoyed this, and we will have more book club episodes. See you next time.